Like in almost any UI technology, in Silverlight we can build different kinds of controls and extend the system with our own controls. Let's take a look here at building user controls. They're the really simplest form of control. A user control, just like it would be really in Windows forms or in ASP.NET, is just an aggregation of existing controls to provide a reusable lump of functionality. User controls are often the least flexible controls, but they're often the easiest to build. So imagine that I'm in my Silverlight project, I've got the standard layout, I've got a Silverlight project, I've got a website that tests it, I've done nothing to it so far. What we're trying to do is build a typical login box, username and password and a button to log in. So let's go to our project and add to this a new item, and the new item will be a Silverlight user control, so this will be this guy here. I'm going to call this a login control, something like that, or login box. Let's call it login box. Oops, box, okay. And what we get is a design experience, just like we do for our main page, of a user control and a grid. And in fact, if you go back to your main page, you'll find that the page itself, when we look at it, is ultimately a user control. And just to say something about this base class of user control here, if we go to the definition of it, you'll see it derives from control. It adds one property called content, i.e. a user control has a content property. And this derives from control. If we go to look at that, then we have some things like horizontal content alignment, tab navigation, and so on. Notice that what we don't have are things like backgrounds and foregrounds, and if we go up to framework element, we won't find those things in here either, though we do have widths and heights and so on in here. And that goes to UI elements. If we go all the way up that hierarchy, things like backgrounds and foregrounds and so on are not really in here, so you're going to have to do some work if you want that sort of stuff. But let's go back to our login box, which is over here. Now, rather than me typing in a whole set of XAML here to give me a UI, let me just paste some XAML in here and then we'll look at it. So let's just get rid of this existing grid and let's paste in a new grid. And what that grid ultimately displays, let's look at it in design mode first, is some text blocks and some text boxes and a button to log in. And look at the XAML for that, where we have a grid. I'm trying to make the grid size such that it will use the available horizontal space by not specifying a width on this column definition, and vertically I'm just getting the rows to size themselves to the content. And in there we've got some text blocks, we've got some text boxes, and we've got a button. Let's go and handle the click event on that button. We'll say click equals on login. We'll go to the code behind this and we'll write that event handler on login. Let me just compile to pick up the variables from the XAML. Now, chances are here that you'd want to run some logic to check the username and the password. I'm not really going to do that here. We'll just have a private function here. We'll call it check password, string username, string password, and we have to assume that this would do something, but check the values, and then what we'll do is just return true. So we've got a fake function to check the password basically. So on login, what we'd want to say is if check password, and we want to pass text username.text and text password.text, then what we'd probably want to do is fire some event to say the user has logged in and pass across the username that they've given. Let's go on ahead and create that kind of event. So we'll just add a public class up here. We'll add a public class. We'll call it username eventargs, something like that, and all we'll put onto that class, having derived it from eventargs, is a property string username, something like that. And then we'll come down and add an event to our class here. So we'll have a public event. This will be event handler of type username eventargs, and that will be logged in, let's say, something like that. And so if we check the password, we can say if logged in is not equal to null, then let's fire that event logged in this with text username.text. So now we have a fake idea that when somebody logs in, we'll check their password and we'll fire this event if they have actually managed to log in based on this dummy function down here. Okay, so let's start using our user control. Let's go back to our main page over here, page.xaml. And into page.xaml, let's just go and double click this for a second. And what we'll do here is we'll get rid of the width and the height for a second. And into our main grid, let's put, in fact, I'm going to replace this grid with a stack panel just to make things easier. So let's have a stack panel here. Stack panel. And into our main stack panel here, let's put an instance of that user control. So we need to register a custom namespace for XAML. So what we do is say xmlns local equals, and we'll use login control, which is the local assembly. So just bringing that in so that we can use types from that namespace in XAML. And then we're going to create a local login box, and that thing should be displayed on the screen. Below that, I'm going to display, let's say, a text block. We'll give that a name of text user, and we'll put some text on there which will say not set, and we'll set the font size to be 24, and we'll set the margin to be 10 all around, something like that. So let's just see what we've got at this point. We press F5. Whoops, we got something that's broken. We needed to create a new instance of the username event args here. So let's create one of those, and on there let's specify username equals that. So I just made a mistake in creating that, firing that event there. Let's see if we can build. Let's see if we can press F5. Let's switch on debugging and let the page spin up. Okay, so it's not perfectly laid out right now, but we've got our control up here with the username and the password on there. We should have really used a password box there. Perhaps we'll come back to that in a second. And we've got our login button, which doesn't currently do anything, and we have our text block, which is over here and not really doing anything either. Notice the sizing on our user control is a little bit strange. It seems to be bigger than I would want it to be. So let's just go back to the user control and check where that sizing is coming from. Looks like that sizing is coming from this width and height here, so let's take those away. I'd like these things just to be as big as they need to be, so let's do that on there, and let's see if that looks any better or worse. Okay, so that's more reasonably sized. It's stretching horizontally and the text is underneath. That's not too bad. And I'd probably like to start doing now is on my main screen, on my main page if you like, when we use this login box, I probably want to handle its logged in event, so I'll say on logged in, and we'll go into the code behind and we'll add an event handler for that. So let's just go into the code behind and say on logged in, and that's going to be a username event args. And what we could do is take the text block that we have and change the text to say, I don't know, string.format user has logged in, something like that, and we can use args.username in order to pick that up from the control we've built. Let's just reformat that text that we have on the screen so that the text alignment is centered, and let's see if we can press that up again, make that run. So now we should be able to say Fred's password, and when we click on the login button, the control should fire that and say that Fred's logged in. So we're now starting to rebuild something that's a bit reusable. But we might want to have properties for the username and password already kind of preset that the surrounding page could set for us. So let's take a look at that. So let's revisit our control over here and pop over to the control and the code that lives behind it. In fact, let me close some windows to make things a little bit easier. Let's go to our control and let's put a property on here. We'll just have a property string. We'll call this username. Probably doesn't make sense to set the password for the user because that kind of defeats the object really. So what we'll do is at the point where this thing is instantiated, let's go ahead and just add a loaded event. So we'll say this.loaded plus equals onLoaded. And let's move to that. Let's just tidy up that code there just to make that neater. And in onLoaded what we'll say is that text username.text equals username. Okay, and I suppose also at the point where somebody does click login and we fire this event, we should also really make sure that the username property that we have also equals text username.text, just in case somebody was to check it from the outside world. Okay, so this is kind of cool. Let's build that, and let's go back to our main XAML page, which is using the control. And here what we'll say is, on the right control, if we got to the login box, what we'll say here is username equals Fred. And so now we're setting this from outside the control, and we can press F5, and we can see this has been pre-populated as Fred. So that's nice, and that's all working the way we expect it to work. One other thing I might want to be able to do is data bind this. So let's go back to our code, and let's build something that we can data bind to. So we'll just add a simple class into this project. We'll add a class. If you've not watched the video about data binding to simple types, it's probably worth having a look at that at this point. Let's call this userdetails.c#, and we'll just do a sort of simple one-way binding here. So we won't do property change notifications, but on user details here we'll have prop string username. Okay, so we've got one of those now, and that means that we should be able to go back to our XAML. Once again, if you've not watched the video on using custom types in XAML, we can also do that here. So let's add into this user control.resources. We'll add a local user details, and we'll say username equals, let's call this Jim so that we can see it, x key equals my user details. Okay, something like that. Okay, so now we've got this username of Jim in my user details, so we should be able to go ahead and say that the username here is bound to username, and the data context for this thing would be the static resource identified by my user details. Okay, so we're now trying to bind this property username across to the username on this object up here by linking it up through my user details here. Let's see if we can build. Let's see if we can press F5. Now I have a bad value, line 13 position 50. Let's go back to line 13 position 50. And it's here, binding of username. Interesting. My user details looks good. Username looks good. But we have a problem. And the problem we've got is that this property over here on the control called username is just a regular .NET property. In order to support binding, we need to use a thing called a dependency property. So how does that look? Well, let me just clear some space on the screen so that we're not cluttered too much. Let's just get rid of all this stuff in our control for a moment and focus on this property called username. So what I'm going to do actually is move this event down a little bit just so that we can focus on username and only username. So at the moment this is just a regular .NET property. There is in Silverlight, and also as it happens in .NET Framework version 3 onwards, a different kind of property called a dependency property. And it's kind of managed by a base class called dependency object, and ultimately user control derives from that base class. So we can have dependency properties on user control, and so also on login box here. But our property right now isn't a dependency property. How do we write one of those? What do we do? Well, let's take a look at it. What we do is we put onto our class a public static dependency property, which we will call username property. That's really a convention. And you create that by walking up to the dependency property system and asking to register a new property. You provide the name, which in our case is username. You provide the type, which in our case is going to be a string. You provide the type which owns it, which in our case is going to be login box. And you can also provide a callback to be notified when this dependency property is changed on any object. That's one of the features of dependency properties. You can kind of get change notifications without having to sync up many event handlers to receive them. So let's just say null here because I don't care about that. So we've got this username property now which we can use as a key, and we can use it as a key with our base class, which ultimately is dependency object. So instead of having this property quite like this, what we're going to have is a different non-default getter and setter. And what we'll do in the get here, let's just finish off the set as well. There we go. So what we're doing in the get here is we're going to reach into our base class and return as a string base.getValue. GetValue comes from dependency object, and what you give it is the key of the property you want to get the value for. So in our case that's going to be username property. So what this is kind of doing is, one of the things it's doing at least, is it's centralizing the storage for this property in the base class. We don't actually have a field to back this property. We use something like a dictionary in the base class to store it, using a key to index which value it is we want from that dictionary, if you like. And that saves us some storage for this username property. We also get things like this centralized change notification mechanism, which we're not actually using up here, but we talked about just a second ago. When it comes to time to set the value, we call base.setValue. We pass the key and we pass the value. Other than that, this thing looks like a regular property. The consumer of this property doesn't necessarily have to know it is a dependency property, but we know that it is, and we know it can be accessed using this key as well as using this convenience property here. Consequently, if we go and build now with this as a dependency property, we should be able to press F5 and hopefully we fixed our problem. And we have, and you can see that we now got username of Jim up here, and that has come from the data binding. We password in there of foo and log in, and we can see that Jim has logged in. And what that's allowed us to do, moving across to this dependency properties here, is that when we're using our page.xaml, not only can we just set declaratively properties in the XAML file, we can also data bind to them. So here we're data binding to username, which comes from my user details, which is an object up here where username is set to Jim. We just declaratively bind. So hopefully you've got a bit of a feel as to how you can start building these user controls, how you can fire events from them, how you can surface properties from them, and how you can start to do things like data binding with those properties so that you can be as declarative as possible when somebody is using your particular user control.